be open to further conversation and dialogue, I think is valuable. I do think that the structure where council members in particular were, I won't say gagged, but were, didn't engage, but instead it was a listening session, I think was the appropriate approach, particularly at this phase in our relationship with that community. The one thing that stuck out to me was, as I look at our agenda and the roundtable scoping that we've done and desired outcomes, we listed 5 different things that we wanted to accomplish out of this process, and frankly, I don't think that we've accomplished those. I think we've done some good things, don't misunderstand. I'm very appreciative of the work. I think that you did a good job, and I'm glad that this happened, but I think that there's some things that would have been difficult to achieve in this first workshop roundtable forum. So I think either we need to adjust our expectations of what can be accomplished, or we need to find other strategies to hit these 5 points. And I don't read them to you now, but I just don't think we got everything done that we set out to do with this group. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's part of what we learned in the process. Thank you for putting together the questions and the challenging questions, frankly, that you put to the members of the development community, because I think you did engage them with some fairly provocative leading questions, which is what was needed and got you the kind of results that you got. It will be interesting to see where we go from here, what the next provocation will be in order to build our relationship. And I think that some of the things that you've said here, their willingness to continue to engage, the things that they've identified as assets that we need to build upon, and just the discussion of the need for a cultural paradigm shift and how we take that on, not together, not just as city government, but as a community, is really intriguing to me. I think it's a heck of a challenge, frankly.
Something that just is really resonating right now is something that came out of this was this idea that they felt like we were starting at no, that we weren't starting at yes on projects. And it's so funny because from what I'm hearing out in the community is they feel like we say yes to everything. And so we've got these two diametrically opposed views. And yet, what's really happening? Because when I've talked to some of somebody who's actually just did a project downtown, they were thrilled with the process. They said, I don't know where you guys got this rap for being so slow and everything. We had it in and out the door with what we needed, and we were building within so many days. He said it was a great process. And so I'm wondering, looking at these two different views, if part of our problem is our PR, that people don't really understand how the system works, that things have changed over the years. I mean, some of these people are working from something that happened 20 years in the past, not necessarily what's happening today. And so, and that's for the public too, that we're holding on to so much stuff. We're not moving forward. So it's really changing the conversation about where we're really at.
Find those successes, celebrate successes. We have in our office, we have a mantra that we always celebrate our team's success. And maybe as we identify where those projects occurred and what occurred to get to that point of success. It's a great promotional feature. It really is. It's not like come here and we're going to open the gates and let everybody do whatever they need. That's not what you're intending. It's how did the community work to make sure that you have successful projects? How did the city work to make a successful project? That's a promotional thing. That's a very powerful story. Yeah, thank you.
Just one more. I was just astounded by how present the rite of passage still was in the conversation. Came up repeatedly through the evening, and I guess I wasn't ready for that. So it was surprising.
So the rite of passage is the project on the isthmus that Not in favor.
failed,
Yeah.
and did not go forward.
Okay,
Just,
thank you.
yeah, absolutely. I think it's contextually important, because, thank you. So, I gotta say, the facilitators, Annette, Renee, Michael, you guys were heroic. I really do think you did a great job.
Thank you.
I think that you went, you were, consistent and really helpful in keeping the conversation flowing respectfully, and so I really appreciate it. So thanks again for that.
Thank you for the comment.
Yeah. So, I am mindful of time because we have a second agenda item that we need to get to. I do want to talk a little bit about outcomes, and Lorelei and Jay, I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to share. Jay, you were there, and I'm just I don't mean to put you on the spot. You don't have to share anything. Certainly, we can fold it into the conversation, the sort of next steps in terms of CRA. But if you have any observations.
No, I think that discussion folds very nicely into it, because I think it informs how we might all want to think about a process to move CRA forward, sensitive to a variety of interests and both momentum but not getting ahead of ourselves. So I think a lot of those themes will inform the kind of issues hopefully we're going to talk about in various options. So
Great.
take note.
Okay, thanks. Lorelei, anything?
It seems like there might be an opportunity to think about a roundtable number 2 that's related to moving the CRA conversation forward
Okay.
in some way, or the RFP process, so we'll just sort of keep that in our minds as we go into the next agenda item. Sounds like it was a really productive set of conversations and that there's some appetite for follow-up there.
Good. So, Keith, anything on your side?
Obviously, we're at a very important point in the city's processes. We have a comp plan that we'll be considering very shortly. But then the real work starts of implementing the comprehensive plan, and that's where I think a lot of the fear was directed, was how is the city going to implement its comprehensive plan? We have these fairly broad goals. We have some that are pretty specific and prescriptive. And what are the economic development impacts of those decisions? And involved in that community and that process will be helpful.
So, for my part, and I think I want to build a little bit off of what Nathaniel was saying in terms of our outcomes. I'd like to keep those in front of us if we can, and I actually sort of wonder what the committee might think about an invitation to our EDC partners to help flesh out some responses, sort of more in a draft kind of form of things that we could do next in response to each of those outcomes. Thinking that might be a way to continue the conversation with our Economic Development Council partners and help. I recognize that from the roundtable discussion, we didn't get those answers directly, but I think that we have some things to work with, and maybe we could help start floating as trial balloons with what the responses are to each of those outcomes. I want to just also acknowledge that from my own perspective, the opportunity site process was a suggested methodology for how we do business within the city. It wasn't really ever, from my own perspective, wasn't ever conceived to be, let's just lock into these opportunity sites. These are the only places to develop. The suggestion was to do our best thinking about what sites are going to potentially drive development unless we get proactive about them. And how can we get ahead of the game in particular hotspots in the city or potential hotspots by doing research, engaging property owners, engaging stakeholders, negotiating and facilitating between the different stakeholders, issues, and interests, and come up with a more proactive approach to the hotspots. And those spots are going to change all the time. But how do we build internal capacity to do that kind of research and stay current on those cycles? So every year we're sort of checking in. Are last year's opportunity sites still this year's opportunity sites? What other, what are the hotspots that we should be trying to proactively get ahead of? I think we were recognizing that we don't, we have some good modeling in terms of how we research opportunity sites. So the challenge for the city is how do we build internal capacity to, on an ongoing basis, do that kind of research and stay ahead of the game so that we're not being driven as a city by whatever permit request shows up on planning and community development's counter. That instead, what we're helping to facilitate bringing quality permits to the counter by helping to facilitate, the partnership concept. So I wanted to, again, revisit what I think is the methodology that we were trying to get to emerge out of the opportunity side approach. And maybe we can memorialize that in a little bit clearer way, if that sounds right to folks. Okay, so general yes nods from committee there. And Michael and Annette, is it okay to maybe have you folks consider some draft responses to these kinds of, to the outcome questions? Is that okay? Okay. So I think that would be a helpful next step process. And unless there's more on this particular item, I'm going to move us to our next agenda item. You good? All right. So, next steps in terms of community renewal. And yeah, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you. And stay. Continue to party with us. The next agenda item, we're going to put on pants.
We'll be here, how about?
So Keith.
Yes, sir. I've asked Jay to kick this off
Okay.
by going through the three options that we developed. And obviously Lorelei and I will be here to help support that process.
So we were asked to think about how to further discussion about community renewal, what steps we might take to generate the discussion or ramp it up or create some momentum for decision making, but at the same time not get too far ahead of ourselves, which is to suggest not to rush through some kind of process and actually create unintended consequences by going there. So what we did is we developed three different options, and we sort of have a modification of one of them to try to come up with the right kind of balance to enable the city council, if you choose, to take some reasonably decisive action to actually move forward, but at the same time to do it carefully so that we do it fully informed and fully prepared to take only that step and not steps that we're not prepared to take. So option A is sort of the go forward full stop. And it means go to council relatively quickly, end of the year, beginning of the year, with a full-blown Community Renewal Act ordinance, which would do many things. And there are about 3 or 4 components And the options separate some of these components out. But one of them is you make a finding of blight in certain areas. You define a geographic area, that would be the community renewal area. You go out with requests for proposals or qualifications from property owners and developers to deal with these problem areas. And you approve a plan that envisions what you'd like to see through the eradication of this blight. And when we looked at that option, which is sort of the path that the city was going down, we became concerned, candidly, because we don't believe there's actually a consensus viewpoint on what the vision's going to look like, and therefore, any plan that you would adopt in the near term would have to be pretty vague, would likely be very vague, or be very controversial because not enough consensus building had been done, and not enough market testing had been done, whether you have the resources to implement this plan, assuming you knew what the plan was that you wanted to implement. And that it seemed to us that that could create a problem of expectations and give a signal even to the marketplace that maybe we don't really have our act together quite yet. And that we're hurtling down without the notion of what resources we really want to put in and what vision we have. So what are we asking people to actually do? And we thought there could be negative unintended consequences of that. So you screw up a lot of concern that we're hurtling down the path and we're not sure we've reached that path. And other people look at this as confusion and don't want to participate. So that was option A. And but it is the most decisive path, and it says let's get on with this. We've really talked a lot. Let's get the RFQ out there, and let's just hurtle forward. Option B is a variation of that, which takes into consideration the disadvantages of the option A. And it separates the legislative actions. And it's a model that was done in other cities. Shoreline was an example. So in this one, you do what you can do first. You identify the areas of blight that you really want to go after. You define an area that you think deserves the kind of attention needed to realize economic opportunity, social opportunity, and eradicate the blight that's holding everybody down. And you go out with requests for RFP. You basically authorize the economic development director to go out and invite people to come in and tell us what the market might be willing to do. What you don't do is adopt a plan. Because you don't adopt a plan until you've evaluated, you've tested the market, you've received visions and opportunities, you've given developers and property owners time to think and talk about what they want to do and what's possible in the community and maybe what's affordable. And then you come back later, next year, maybe imagine a whole year process, in which you then say, okay, we have now melded a vision that's practical, market tested, we've gone out, engaged with the development community and other citizens as well. Now we'll approve the plan. So you will have gotten the momentum going, but you hold back on the plan, basically asking people to help you in a much more specific way to develop that. The third option, we began to think that, oh my gosh, this process, the CRA process, has gone on so long that it's bumping into the downtown master plan process. So how do we want to think about the integration of those two and the assumption that the CRA area will overlap significantly with the downtown master plan process? And do we want to proceed without having a master plan process in place, or how do we want to think about that? That, in the purest sense, would mean a significant delay or further delay in the CRA process until you solve that one. So in thinking about those and just some side conversations, we came up with an option B2, a modification of option B, which gets us significantly moving forward without the downside of option C, okay, of waiting a long time. So here's what we imagine as an option for you to consider. Proceed in the next several months, end of the year, beginning of the year, with a CRA ordinance that in fact finds the area and authorizes the going out with an RFP, RFQ. But when we think about the area to be depicted, think about it as having two parts. The isthmus, and maybe a little bit of an area around the isthmus that can be developed in a coherent way. And then the rest of the downtown, identifying particular blighted spots within that. So we're not gonna hold back downtown. If there are opportunities to develop and come into partnerships with owners or developers, we don't wanna put that off forever. But we want to acknowledge that perhaps the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge is the isthmus related ones we want to pursue. So you would go out with two kinds of RFQs. For the isthmus portion of the area, you would invite the owners to come back and talk about how would you like to develop your land and how could we as the city partner with you to do that. We'd also perhaps see qualifications from developers for the whole area or part of it, the master developer plan, in a more coherent vision, where they would work with the individual property owners and the city and see if they could compose a more comprehensive vision of the isthmus. And we would get responses back. And then with respect to the rest of the downtown, we would invite the owners, certainly, and maybe some developers, to suggest partnerships or opportunities for redevelopment of those few areas, but not think about a more comprehensive plan. It's too big until we get the master plan further down the road. So we would expect then that you would have pretty decisive action in the December-January period by actually finding an area in two sub-areas and inviting this request for proposals, qualifications to the development community, which will create a tremendous amount of communication, we hope, and proposals, we hope, and a lot of dialogue and communication between and among the property owners, particularly in the isthmus, among themselves and with the developer and the city, so that after a process of many months, we would come up with a more coherent vision that would work with the community. The trick will be defining the RFP, RFQ in a general enough way to identify the various important interests that have to be reflected in any development. That includes not only economic development, but park and open space, view corridors, but also a plan, I would say, that the park that we have and will enlarge, if you will, has to be one that we have enough finances to maintain in a safe and productive way. It's not just create land or just go buy land, assuming we had resources immediately available, but it's also got to be programmed for its life cycle to make sure it's an important asset to whatever other uses there are in the isthmus or downtown. So that's sort of 1B, and the goals are, again, both to change the discussion, move it forward, create some momentum, get more community input, but also market-driven community input to know what's really possible out there in a way that doesn't get us too far ahead of ourselves where we're proposing things that are totally pie in the sky and unrealistic. So the goal will be for you to sort of hopefully to think through these options and see if one or more than one appeals to you with modifications that you might be able to recommend so we can have a course going forward.
So, committee members, questions, clarification from Jay? Want to add anything, Laura?
Just one process point, we have the council work session coming up on the 28th, and the idea would be to have a specific plan of attack to recommend at that point, so that we wouldn't have a series of options. We would have, here's the one that we think makes the most sense, and here's how we got there, is through this kind of process and this conversation here at this table tonight.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's a given. I think
Yeah.
that the committee understands that we're driving towards. We rearranged the meetings so that we could have this discussion, so that we could provide a very clear recommendation if possible. I think I guess I want to elaborate a little bit. We can come to hopefully a consensus about a recommendation, that what happens on the 28th is a work session, so the council won't be making any decisions at that time. However, it's an opportunity for us to, everybody get on the same page if possible, and sort of make sure that questions are answered, and then it's I believe the next business meeting that we have, well, actually, well, I'll check on that, but after the 28th, we could potentially act that evening. It's gonna be tough because you're gone.
I'm done.
Yeah. So, my own hope is that we do all of this work by consensus, and that's what I'm trying to drive towards. Is not. I want us to try to model consensus for the community. I recognize that's going to be really hard, but I think it's something that we should try. Anyway, thanks, Lorelei, and
I have some comments and maybe a question along the way, if I can. Personal critique of options A, B, and C. I find options A and C useful because I think they kind of create some bookends, but neither one of them are appealing to me. Option A, because I don't really believe that we can get through an RFP process in the time frame that's laid out here. Certainly not one that's usable and beneficial and makes sense. Option C doesn't really appeal to me either because I'm anxious to get going on a CRA. I absolutely see the need for ongoing CRA activities to relate to a completed downtown plan. But personally, I'm not willing to wait for the completion of that plan before we start working on economic development in downtown in a meaningful way. So to me, the discussion really hinges between option B1 and option B2. And I really appreciate the B2 being laid out this evening, so thanks for that. I guess, so if I'm understanding them, well, and there may be a D, I'm not sure. Part of our discussion in the past, at least an option that we've talked about is adopting a fairly general plan in order to have a CRA ordinance in place. And that plan, as being general, doesn't provide a whole lot of guidance or confidence, frankly, for the development community. And that's acknowledged. I guess the question is there benefit in our overall process of having an ordinance in place, to have the CRA authorities in place before we move into the development of a call for projects, RFP. And that I don't quite understand yet, so maybe you can help me with that.
I think there's both a legal answer and a non-legal answer. To exercise some of the authorities granted to cities under the Community Renewal Act, you actually have to have a plan that has gone through public hearings. And the big one that you would have off, the big power, the new power you would have that would be authorized would be the power to condemn property that's blighted, and the ability then to use that property not only for normal public uses, but actually then to sell it off for other private uses. So by not proceeding with the plan, you would not have that power until you got your plan in place. Having said that, I think it would be extremely difficult for you to condemn property without a more specific plan that would help you understand what the uses that you really want, how you're gonna pay for the land if you condemn it, and that there may be really to encourage the blighted property owners to think about development as opposed to being passive and aggressive, waiting for you to take them out, you might be better off not to put the plan in place. You're giving them a pretty strong signal. We'd rather work with you. If we can't, there's a route out here. We're just not ready to go there yet. So a lot can happen. Now, all the other kinds of things that you might want to do, if you had a CRA, buy property, sell property, trade property, encourage property owners to work together, do public-private partnerships of various kinds. Candidly, you can do all of those if you have the will and the resources and the plan. You can do that without the plan being an idea, without the formal plan being in place. So I'm not sure you're giving up very much by waiting. I think you're getting a lot in terms of credibility and perhaps owner involvement in ways that you wouldn't get if you were moving or hurtling quickly towards condemnation. My own sense, and I may be missing something, you're not ready to condemn blighted property at this point.
Let me just expand on that a little. So I don't think that we're looking for condemnation authority in the early stages of this process. But the two things that interested me, one was the ability to acquire land for economic development, which is not designed as, or not defined as a public purpose without a CRA. And the other one is the kind of, I'll probably have the terminology wrong, but the site-specific master planning that you can do with CRA that we're not authorized to do otherwise. And so I was concerned about those two.
Well, I think there's something there. Of course, if we decided what we wanted to do and we had it ready, we could then just insert a plan. That general plan you were prepared to do in January and do it in May. And then invoke the powers. But a lot of that you could probably do even without it, depending on what it is you want to do. So I don't think it's, on the critical path to getting the result, I don't think an early plan is important. We can inject the plan if we need special powers, whenever we want.
Thanks.
Can I check an assumption here? So I think those are great questions. And, agree with your points about ABC. Just clarifying, under B2 or whatever it might be, the response from an RFP can inform a plan. And the public hearing is essentially a public hearing on an RFP that the council wanted to pursue. But the content of the RFP can be very specific in terms of what things need to be done, but could only be done under a CRA.
Right.
You know, so it's
But I
not.
would turn it around, I would just say that until we get the responses from the RFP, it's hard to know what the plan is gonna look like.
Right,
Now,
exactly.
if you look at another model, Bremerton, they did a CRA ordinance that they amended about 7 times.
Right.
Which is and this is an ongoing process, it doesn't close down. So I could imagine RFPs coming in and the decision to go in one direction, and maybe you want some more authority or just conservative authority, we can do a plan, have the hearing, approve it, then amend it as we get more specific with other things, if we thought that was appropriate. I don't think you have to do it all in one shot. But I think we still go back to the value of the RFP responses in formulating a plan and taking those responses, negotiating, talking, refining, selling, and then coming up with a plan. I guess let me put it on the point. If we had a plan out there and we have to go through a very elaborate public hearing process, I think you're just going to bring out all the bubbling concerns of that, it's gonna do this as opposed to that, because it's not gonna be specific enough to allay fears.
Julie? you're-
Yeah, because what's happening right now is what drives this community is fear. We're so afraid that we're gonna lose something if we actually talk to one another. That, you know, if I collaborate, that means I'm gonna lose something. I mean, what are we really gonna lose? That we would stop fighting with one another? I mean, that we'd actually maybe lose some apathy in the neighborhoods and an electorate that's not really engaged. Heaven forbid we lose those things. So for me, I think it's really, we need that RFP. We need to bring something to the public so we can talk about it, so we can actually have an honest conversation to say, this is what's actually possible market-wise, and this is really gonna meet the community's needs, or it's not. So I really want that RFP, whatever we wanna call it, process. I think it's such an important part of this, because that's how we have that, finally, we get to that community discussion, it gets beyond the fear, where we actually have something concrete to talk about.
Yeah. I think our worst fear is we send out invitations to this party and no one comes. That will tell us something as well, and we're hopeful that doesn't happen. What is likely to happen, I hope, is that we will get some serious developer interest, and then we negotiate with the developer about how to compromise everybody's interests in order to have a viable whole. That would be a great result if we can get there.
Well, it'll be the first time the community actually has a real seat at the table, because we have something to bring to the table.
Right. And I was imagining, you know, even as we were talking about the developer roundtables, have developer roundtables and to talk about how they see this
Right.
signal from the market, and is it adequate, and have others there to talk about how we can have a very robust discussion around something concrete. And frankly, someone who has a vision and wants to invest money,
Right.
that's missing right
Exactly. Yeah, so, yeah, I appreciate the conversation. So, I do think that the community responds best when they can really see what they're gonna get, what, you know, and I think that, and I think the community also responds well when they have an opportunity to inform and shape, you know, the product. So there's this other part that I think is really important related to the master plan and that process. My own interest, I want to do a master plan for downtown. I think that that's a critically important element to the future of downtown. And in some ways, I think it was nicely, you know, we sort of got some glimpses in the community at large when EPA came here and started talking about, you know, how to do things on Capitol Way. I think that's a good example of how we can engage in a master planning process. And scoping needs to happen in terms of what kinds of data and information are necessary in order to fill out a master plan. So my own bias is that master plans fail when they try to drive the market rather than when they work with the market. So that's how master plans fail, by attempting to drive a market that isn't there. And from my own perspective, the community renewal process has every opportunity to help a master plan process succeed and work well if it happens together. Because what a product could be out of this RFP process is the market reality from property owners and investors and saying, this is what we want to do, this is what we will bring to the table. And that can help inform a master plan process. What we don't have at the moment, and I believe it has been a constant struggle in Olympia, is, you know, we have the plans and the pipe dreams and the visions, but we haven't brought it together with the realities of the market. And the CRA does provide those tools, I think, that are particularly appropriate to the kind of market reality that we're dealing with in Olympia. We have property owners and developers that are living a reality in Olympia where rents and margins from sales are just not gonna drive investment. They're just not there. So unless we find how to close that market gap with something that truly adds value to the public, and by public value, I mean really is strongly recognized by the community as something that would really be of value if the city was to invest in it. And also be structured in a way that would close a gap for a developer to put their money into the equation. So if we can bring these two things together under option 2, or option B2A, subsection 1. But I think that my hope is that we can articulate the connection between CRA and the downtown master plan and how those things, that kind of work informs a master plan. And be really clear in terms of the scoping of the master plan process can help inform, the CRA work. But unless we get some partners, we're just guessing at the market. We're just, the thing that constantly is on my mind, we have an eroding revenue base as a city. Every year, our revenue base is being further eroded because of actions of the state and federal government, and also because of our tax system is quite regressive, and it doesn't give us the ability to collect receipts in a way that can get ahead of inflation or benefit costs. All the cost drivers are there, but our revenue base is being eroded. So whatever this community has an appetite to do, whether it is expanding parklands or doing operation and maintenance or doing investment in the parks that we have currently, just to keep up with maintenance, keeping Percival Landing opening, whatever we have an appetite to do as a community, unless we address the revenue side of the equation, we're not going to be able to do anything. We're going to fail. And so we have to strike a balance between we don't want to compromise on our environmental objectives. We don't want to compromise on our social objectives. We don't want to compromise on our economic development objectives. So we have to find ways of moving forward where we're complementing all three areas. And I think that needs to be clarified to our larger public in terms of what our capacity is, what our real revenue capacity is. I mean, one of the reasons why I think we need to reach out for very specific quality development is that if we fail to do so, we're just going to continue to see a radical erosion of our revenue base. So, and I don't want to do just any kind of development. I don't want to just continue to be reactive to whatever shows up on the counter at CP&D. What I would like to do is I would like to be proactive in our development, and that means giving the public a voice in what's being designed. It's not just say, well, design it however you want. No, it's giving the public a voice in that. That's a partnership. It's giving the public an opportunity to say what the project should be and where it should be. And that's not a private model, and it's not a public model, but it's the hybrid. And trying to tell that story, I think, or telling that story is our challenge, and supporting it with everything that we've heard from the developers, as well as good things that have happened in other communities as a result of building the partnerships, and perhaps even some things that have failed when communities have just tried to drive a master plan without any kind of prayer that the market is followed. So that's my spiel.
Couple other comments, if I might.
No, sorry.
No.
Yeah.
So under option B2, where we do an RFP process and we use that process to inform the plan. I think that does resolve a lot of the concerns of the community, gives the community to respond to the specific proposals, which I'm just reiterating here a bit, but I do think it's very valuable. I think that has been one of our biggest challenges is the uncertainty of what the heck are you guys talking about? The pig in the poke problem. So I think that I'm liking that. It does put a lot of pressure then on the call for projects and the crafting of that document. And that's fine. And that's what we need to do, is craft that in a way that represents our interests and what we're trying to achieve. Jay, I was a little concerned by your suggesting that we treat proposals for the isthmus different from proposals for downtown. I'm not sure I understand the motivation for that suggestion.
Sure.
And if I recall, you were suggesting that folks who are making a proposal associated with the isthmus would need to bring forward a more comprehensive view, whereas those in downtown could have a more isolated project, if I'm understanding what you said.
Well, I think there's a certain logic to thinking about the isthmus a little bit more holistically, that the city owns quite a bit of land there, and that the uses can be moved around consistent with environmental and park uses in a way that we would want to invite someone to look at a little bit more holistically. Whereas the rest of the downtown, until we get the downtown master plan in place, kind of hard to think holistically. And we also, there's a bandwidth problem too, I have to say. I mean, I don't know how many proposals, holistic proposals about downtown we can think about. We don't want to, we may not be ready for a lot of major redevelopment, CRA planning in downtown, but we should not foreclose the opportunity to develop blighted properties if they come up. But in terms of priority and the holistic opportunities of the isthmus, I think it is segregable, and we ought to think about them differently. So in other words, one of the options we're thinking about is let's just talk isthmus. Say, no, that's wrong. There are expectations in the community that the CRA is going to be bigger, and we've got some blighted areas out there. So let's create the CR area, the whole thing, but let's divide it into two tracks and a different emphasis.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Julie?
I'm
Yeah.
glad to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of plays into that, I wanted that broad kind of pool so that we can get the best proposals that kind of rise to the top. So I'm good with having it as two separate, because it doesn't preclude either one.
No.
Think about the process that we went through with the CAC on the isthmus. That was a sort of 3 or 4 different approaches to master planning the isthmus, and you could imagine someone potentially coming forward with a proposal that looked at how you play with over time and in partnership with the city, as opposed to some of the smaller infill sites that are scattered around throughout downtown that have been part of this conversation, but that are individual developments as opposed to larger areas that are connected to other types of infrastructure investments or open space investments that might also need to be made at the same time.
So I guess my reaction is, I think that's great to be open to the holistic look at the isthmus, but I wouldn't want to preclude
No.
the
Right.
property owner who has an idea for their property.
No, exactly
No,
correct.
exactly.
And what we would thought is, we would invite individual property owners as well as developers in some very preliminary conversation with property owners. They're not, the ones that frankly I've spoken to say, no, I would consider selling, I would consider partnering with the developer, I would consider a more optimal land use there, and so there's some flexibility that we ought to seize upon, I think, which it's less clear in the rest of the downtown. We shouldn't miss this opportunity that you spend so much time thinking.
Yeah, so the thing that's always most exciting to me about community renewal initiatives is if you do it under a CRA ordinance, it becomes development on the community's terms.
Yes.
And I don't think folks have gotten that message clear enough. This is not just any kind of development. It's only the development that the community wants, and it's done by ordinance. So it's an invitation to come to the party for investors in the market, but it isn't a blank check. It isn't a gift of money. It isn't a gift of property. It's contractual terms. And I think the purpose of CRA has been consistently distorted by a few folks that are primarily driven by fear. Unless we can turn that around and really help people understand that the only way that a CRA works is if it is a fully vested, or a fully vetted process that has been inclusive, that